Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Inner Loops YouTube channel. I am Kira, and today, as part of our Authors Corner series, I'll be having a conversation with Leila Rafei about her new novel, Spring. For more Leila and more Authors Corner, you can check out our website to find her article with the Washington Independent Review of Books, her episode of our podcast, The Inner Loop Radio with Courtney and Rachel, a written transcript of this interview, and most importantly, a link to purchase the book. So hi, Leila, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Yes. So first off, you mentioned at our November reading, which you can also find on our YouTube channel, that you had read a much earlier draft of this project with us back in 2017. What did the novel to be look like then, and how did it become the work that it is today?
Well, actually, the pages that I read for that event were, I think, and they ended up being pretty close, actually. That was like maybe one of the very few parts of those early drafts that I think, made it to the final manuscript, like relatively intact. But I think overall the book at that time, I had rewritten it so many times. I think I originally rewrote it completely from a different character's perspective, and then I changed it. I added perspectives. So it really took, actually, I think I might have even written it in first person for the first draft, which was,
Oh, fascinating.
yeah, I think because it was the kind of the first long form piece that I had ever taken on, I think for me, putting it in first person just made it easier to get it out on the page. So, but then once I saw it, I was like, no way. And I just rewrote the entire thing.
Fascinating. So the first draft was first person from Sawad's perspective?
No, actually, it was from Rose's perspective. And then, and then I actually hadn't even thought about, well, I hadn't really fleshed out the character of Sawad yet for that first draft, but as I continued writing, I did, and she ended up being my favorite character to write.
Fascinating. Okay, yeah. So Rose is right now kind of like one of the more voiceless members of the cast. Like we get a lot from Sammy, from Sawad, from Jamila, and then Rose kind of like exists at the periphery. So it's so interesting that she was the narrator of our first draft.
Yeah. I don't know how that happened. I can't, it's hard for me to pinpoint the reason why. I think I actually just found it more, I don't know, to me, I found it more almost, it was more challenging to write from some of the different characters' perspectives, especially like Jamila, who has like a completely different experience from me.
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, I kind of liked it better because I was kind of finding like little parts of my own experience were kind of shining through in different ways that I just wasn't expecting. And I think in the end just turned out more true, I think, to the story I wanted to tell.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay. Yeah, my next question was about the three-story structure, and that we have a novel here that follows three principal characters. We have Sammy, the student, his mother, Sawad, and his girlfriend's maid, Jamila. And though, interestingly, reading it, like even when I was typing that out, I'm like, Sammy would seem to be the center, but that isn't how it feels reading it. There's a lot of texture to the story, and especially the stories of the women in his life that really bring them to the foreground. So how did you come to this three-story structure, especially now knowing that kind of Rose was the start?
I think they just like throughout the process of writing, they were just kind of the characters that grabbed me the most in the writing process, especially Sawad and Jamila. I wasn't even planning it, but as I was writing, I just found myself like the story just kind of flowed more when I was writing from their perspective. So I think that's how they kind of ended up being more central to the final book than I had originally planned. Like I would have never thought it would be that case when I first started.
Fascinating, yeah. Okay, so something that really overwhelmed me in the novel is the pressure and the violation of privacy. So from the very opening sequence about the doorman to Suad's secret drawer, Rose's diary, the photographer towards the end, that really beautiful image or horrifying image of like the stacks of sunflower seeds outside Jamila's door. How do you think about the public versus private life in this story and the way that it affects the characters?
I mean, I think that it kind of contrasts with what's going on in the country as a whole, because it's like this huge public movement where it's like this collective expression of, frustrations and anger. with the government, since it's taking place at the time of the Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it contrasts just with like the internal world that everybody is facing. And I think in a way, I think part of it might be why a character like Sawad struggles so much with coming to terms with the revolution, is that she's not the type of character that would, exhibit those kind of like that kind of sentiment publicly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it just kind of contrasts. I think the different characters' perceptions of what's going on politically also kind of reflects how they feel about expressing themselves in their private lives too.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. So, yeah, I'd love to talk more about the timeline in this setting as well. So, the entire novel takes place over 18 days, right at the start of the Arab Spring. How did you come to the timeline of the narrative of writing a piece of historical fiction?
Well, I think one of the things that kept me from writing, like I had wanted to write a novel for so long, but I was always kind of overwhelmed with the thought of like chronology, like where do I start, where do I end, how do I cover such a span of time? It seemed like it was too much for me to even think about getting started. So I was lucky that the Arab Spring in itself, in Egypt at least, kind of gave me that structure. It was kind of like built in naturally because the revolution really did take 18 days. And it was kind of something I remember, like when I was there walking around Tahrir Square, and like people had spray painted 18 days. I think there was one line that was spray painted on the wall outside of my school that said like all it took was 18 days. So that was kind of like 18 days kind of stood out, intrinsically for the story. And then it just ended up giving me the structure that I needed to kind of wrap my head around, the events of the story. I felt like if I could constrain it to those 18 days, I could really focus on the characters themselves instead of like wrapping my head around, the story as a whole. I also think that it was interesting to show like day by day what was happening because everything kind of unfolded so quickly. I think that focusing on those 18 days just kind of shows how fast the world in Egypt changed at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are trying to go about their everyday lives while it's just changing so rapidly around them. And I felt like focusing on those days really showed that. Whereas if I kind of like zoomed out and did like a longer term piece, I don't think it would necessarily show, the speed at which everything happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting to see such different perspectives on it. Yeah, like we talked about with Suad kind of just being completely in denial, her daughter like running a Facebook forum from her room.
Yeah.
Sammy being kind of like swept up in his own ideas. And I agree with you that Jamila feels like the most distinct.
Mhm.
What inspired you to start writing her story, and how did you come even to the narrative arc of hers is so fascinating. Like her final scene in that luxurious apartment
Yeah.
is such like an interesting turn in comparison to the other two characters, which have a more maybe traditional arc. How did you come to her and her character arc?
Well, I think like when I started, I didn't have really like the confidence as a writer to approach a character whose experience was so different. I was really, like how could I even begin to imagine like, she's a survivor of sexual assault, of war, living as a refugee. It just felt like something I was really afraid of touching, but I tried to kind of keep in mind my limitations as somebody who hadn't experienced the same things. And I kind of drew on like pieces of, the stories that I had heard and the little experiences that I had as much as possible. Like I actually volunteered at a refugee resettlement organization in Cairo. And
Mm-hmm.
I met a lot of women that were like Jamila, living in as refugees, often working as housekeepers, often stalked and harassed like that. So I kind of drew on the stories that I heard from these different women. Um, and then, yeah, I guess using that and a little bit of, making up some things in my head, like that's kind of how she took form. But I was like extremely conscious of the fact that I was, not that voice, specifically. I know there's like a lot of, controversy about who writers write about. um,
Mhm.
especially coming from like a different ethnic background too.
Mhm.
So but I mean, I don't know, I personally don't believe that writers should like constrain themselves to who they can write about, but I did try to be as conscious of that as possible. And I just kind of knew there were some things that I just couldn't, um, imagine, and, just kind of tried to keep it at what I thought I could. But it's
Yeah,
hard to
yeah.
explain. I think it just kind of took some awareness, basically,
Mhm.
of that kind of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that you worked in a resettlement center, I feel like is huge because it's such a distinct setting in the novel. Like those sections
Yeah,
really stand out to me. And the idea that she is like coming to this place, she's in front of a stranger. The detail about the guy with the pimple, like, will stand out to me
yeah.
forever. That was so good. Oh. And being forced to just kind of like bear your trauma again and again to people
Mhm.
over and over. And I really loved that image of like they give her this stack of all of her trauma to hold, and it's like this is
Yeah,
your ticket out, and you have to carry it.
yeah,
But I really like the way that you portrayed that as well, of like she's externalizing it into an object, and then she feels kind of like safe and like she finally got it out in some ways. Because I could see that being a burden in another place.
yeah.
Um, so it's interesting to think about that and that experience. Was that similar to your experience working in the resettlement center, where you felt like these women were just forced to kind of like relive over and over to prove that they needed their
Mhm.
way out?
Yeah, it felt really absurd. Just like you had this short amount of time to sit down with somebody and ask them about extremely personal things. Especially the women, I think sometimes um, had a little difficulty explaining the full depth of what had happened to them, especially when it came to sexual assault. So it just felt really weird. And, I didn't know what I was doing. I was a volunteer. Um, and just to think that we were in charge of you know this person's fate in that way, whether they would get resettled or not. And then also just knowing what a long shot it was for everybody, whether they were ended up getting resettled. It was like such a small chance, and it seemed so random. It was like just a matter of like, was their file picked up by the right person at the right time, things like that. So it was just so weird, honestly, and it felt really jarring. So I think if it comes off that way in the novel too, it was kind of how it felt in real life as well. The absurdity too of like holding everything that she had experienced on paper in her hands. Um, Even that, I think, for somebody like her who was coming out with that stuff like for the first time, it's really jarring.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about Sawad as well. I know in your reading, you read the section of her in the lemon grove, and those are some of my favorite like scenes of just like being able to smell and feel the place. She's so like, oh, I wish I had like my toes in the dirt right now.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating to see her as like a woman alone and the things that she feels that she cannot control and the feels that she things that she feels she can control. The scene where she's like ripping at the weeds felt really intense to me, of just like this is a woman who does not feel like she can do this to any other part of her life except her garden. So
Right.
I'd love to hear more about how like the garden came to be, especially and some of the inspirations for Suad, how you found her and her voice and her place.
Well, I think the garden, it was kind of funny because, I mean, on one hand, I was living in DC, not in DC, but I was living in Northern Virginia at the time, in the suburbs where I grew up. And, it's obviously very green and, kind of idyllic in that way. And I think I was able to that's like one way I think that like my actual surroundings while writing the book shone through, because obviously like the Virginian DC suburbs are extremely different from Cairo or, the cities around it. So I think in a way I drew on that, but also I knew nothing about planting and gardening and everything at the time. I just kind of like, it's funny how it just ended up being so central to her character. And I think now, like today, I'm super into it. But at the time, I was really just, it was something new to me. And again, I think it was just a way to kind of bring in my actual surroundings um, in a story that just, was literally taking place on the other side of the world. Um, and I think the inspiration for that, it's hard to say because things it just kind of like ended up unfolding that way. I think when I originally thought of that character, I had no clue that that's what she would be into, but I think it just kind of flowed naturally from her character as a person, being somebody who was a little neurotic and did have issues with, you know, trying to control things that she couldn't. And I just felt like coming from where she did, especially, it just seemed kind of natural. You know, and she wasn't living in Cairo. She's living in a city near Cairo that, you know, in the Delta, that maybe has a little bit more space for doing that. And I think it just kind of flowed naturally. It's hard to kind of pinpoint on a single inspiration for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really love the scene also where the like boys are kind of like mocking her and calling her, and she pulls out the camera and she takes their picture.
Yeah.
It's like really powerful. And she went from thinking like this is something awful, that's a danger to me, to this is something that if documented, I can use as my ticket, and like the reclaiming of power in that way. So I really loved that scene. And I like how it is in contrast too to Sammy's scene where he's like being photographed with Rose is like the end of his world.
Yeah.
And thinking about the way that like documentation comes up in the novel of the way that things are fossilized, the way that things are changing so quickly, you can't document it.
Right.
Yeah, how do you think about that and the idea of in this really like in this time period full of strife, how documentation like means such different things to the different characters?
I think, yeah, it is. It's a very good question. I feel like, I think that I think that documentation, it really differs based on who is the person that's wielding it. You know, like the person behind the camera in both cases is the person with the power, obviously. But then on the same hand, I also think in a way it's kind of documentation is kind of futile in both ways, because in Jamila's case, she spends the entire novel trying to find documents that will support her case. And, you know, like whether those things, it's kind of, she's told that like everything relies on them, but in the end, like, you know, they don't really. It's just kind of like a way to make her run around the town, and, you know, it's these impossible hoops that she needs to jump through. And then I think, yeah, and I think for the photos, actually, that was another kind of like big thing that that I saw with the revolution as well. There really were people who were sent to Tahrir Square to kind of like intimidate protesters, taking their pictures, not even just like well after those 18 days, since demonstrations just continued. And it was just part of a way to like intimidate people. And I think that that's just kind of interesting. I don't think from an American perspective, you would think like, it's kind of scary. Actually, you know, now just knowing more about surveillance and stuff, you're like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Even here too, you wouldn't, you know, it's kind of like a sinister thing. But it was just kind of new to have the idea of somebody following you and photographing you, and then what are they going to do with that? You know, what is the point? What are they trying to say? So I think that kind of, yeah, I think that just kind of, again, it was one of those experiences that was really drawn from real life, and then ended up just kind of showing like a broader dynamic, you know, between like the person on one side of the lens and the other, that I think was kind of central to the like political themes.
Yeah, absolutely. So that actually brings us to our last question. For the Authors Corner project, we're promoting authors who have published with small or indie presses. Could you talk to us a little bit about your path to publication and your experience with Blackstone?
Sure. So, well, the path to publication is really long, and more it's like a lot more, there's a lot more steps involved than I think you would expect. And I'm glad that I didn't know that when I started. It's really, I guess, like when you're first writing, you're just like, I just need to write this. I just need to get this on paper, and then hopefully it'll get published. But it's really like, it's a much longer process than that. So, I found my agent, luckily, relatively quickly, and she worked with me to, kind of improve the draft manuscript. And then we went out on submission, and even that was kind of a longer process. So it took, even after that kind of the manuscript that I sent my agent, I think it took some revisions. It took, we sent it around a bunch of times to publishing houses. And then finally, I remember the moment that I got the, it was early in the morning, and she sent me an email that she wanted to talk to me on the phone, and she was really excited. So I knew it was good news. I remember I was like on the way to work. I was like standing on the platform at a subway stop in New York called J Street Metro Tech. Yeah, I just remember that moment. I remember the call that I had that day. I was at work, so I remember just like kind of hiding in the hall and talking, and it was so exciting. It was really, it's funny too, because I feel like my coworkers were some of the first people I told, just because like, at that hour, they were the ones who were there. And then, yeah, through publication, I worked with a really great editor, and we were able to just, perfect the manuscript as much as I could. And yeah, I think the best part was picking the cover as well. Yeah, Blackstone really let me, I think have a say in the process more than I think a lot of publishers might allow. And it was just so fun. Like, and it's kind of like writing, I think. And I feel like I do it a lot myself in work when I'm working with graphic designers, is like, as a non-designer, you have all these ideas that are really bad, and you need to kind of see them materialize to realize that they're bad. So I think like it was kind of the same thing. I was like making the designer be like, do this, do that. And then I would be like, yeah, it's not a great idea. But in the end, it was really fun. And I remember just like polling like everybody that I knew, which cover do you like? Which one do you like? And then finally ended up choosing one that was pretty close actually to the very first one that he designed. So
yeah, I love it. It's so striking.
Yeah.
I'll show it to the camera. Ooh. There you go. If you want to see the cover more closely, you should buy it. Wonderful. Okay, so could you let our viewers know where on the internet they can find you?
Well, I have a website. It's leilarafei.com. It's just the way my name is spelled.com. And you can find the book on Amazon, on basically any platform that sells books, I think. So that's not a very good pitch, I don't think. But
yeah, do you have, you want to tag like your Twitter and your Instagram?
Sure, yeah. My Twitter and my Instagram are Leiloushi, so that's Leilooshi. And you can follow me there. I will post, from time to time where you can find the book as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and you can also find the book in real life at the Author's Corner in the Potter's House. And you can find us, The Inner Loop, at The Inner Loop Lit on Instagram and Twitter, as well as at just The Inner Loop on Facebook and on the Inner Loop YouTube channel, which you are currently on. Thank you so much, Leila, for your time today. It was wonderful to speak to you.
Thank you, Kira.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to end the recording.